He told his wife, "We don't need kids," and she left without another word. 5 years later, he saw her with 2 identical boys, and they had his eyes. The sun was beginning to set over the Los Angeles skyline, casting a golden glow across the glass walls of the Harper estate. Inside, the house was silent except for the clink of ice in a glass of whiskey and the distant hum of a waterfall feature in the courtyard. Jason Harper stood tall near the window, his reflection barely visible against the darkening sky. His tailored suit clung to his broad frame, immaculate as always, yet his posture betrayed a deep tension simmering just beneath the surface. Behind him, Sarah hovered near the doorway to the living room. Her light brown hair was tied loosely, and her soft brown eyes shimmered with something between sadness and disbelief. She had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, trying to find the perfect moment, the right words, the least painful tone. But none of it mattered now. The moment was here, and it was burning like acid. "I want to try," she said softly. "We've built a life, Jason. A beautiful one. But it's empty without children. I want to grow this family. I need to." Jason didn't turn to face her. His hand tightened around the glass, and for a long stretch of seconds, silence filled the space between them. Finally, his voice cut through the air, low, sharp, and absolute. "Kids, no. We don't need them." The words fell like bricks. Sarah blinked, stunned, her chest rising as though she had taken a blow. Her hands trembled slightly, and she forced herself to speak even though her throat felt like it was closing. "What do you mean, we don't need them? You said before that maybe, one day." "That was before," he snapped, spinning to face her now. His eyes, a piercing icy blue, held no warmth. "Before I realized how fragile this is. This company, this reputation, this life. You think I built all of this to ruin it with diapers and screaming and sleepless nights? I can't be a father. I won't." Sarah stared at him, stunned at how quickly he turned cold. Her heart was beating so loudly she could hear it in her ears. This wasn't about money. Not for her. She had loved him when he was just an ambitious young man with big ideas and no capital. But now he stood before her like a stranger, someone who measured value in stocks and control, not in joy or love or hope. "So that's it," she whispered. "You're choosing your empire over your own family." "There is no family," he replied coldly. "Not if you insist on this." For a moment, she didn't move. Just stood there, absorbing the finality of what he'd said. Her lip trembled, but she straightened her shoulders and reached for her coat draped over the back of a chair. As she walked to the front door, her steps were slow, deliberate. He didn't follow. He didn't call her back. And then she was gone. Jason remained by the window long after the sun had disappeared, his whiskey untouched. Outside, the city came alive with lights, but inside the house, everything was dark. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, handsome, powerful, alone. The early evening air in downtown Los Angeles carried the scent of freshly cut flowers and expensive perfume. The rooftop garden of the Grand Marlowe Hotel was filled with elegantly dressed guests, laughing, toasting, murmuring about charity, stock options, and who had just flown in from where. It was one of those glossy fundraisers that Jason Harper used to avoid. But lately, he had been attending more of them, not for the photos or the publicity, but because they were distractions, carefully staged events that allowed him to feel just enough motion to forget how still and hollow his life had become. Jason stood near the edge of the terrace, a champagne flute in hand, nodding politely to some financier he barely remembered meeting. The man was talking about a new AI startup or a mining venture in Peru. Jason wasn't really listening. His eyes drifted past the man's shoulder, scanning the crowd, not for anyone in particular, just out of habit. That was when he saw her. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. Like being punched in the gut without warning. She stood in the middle of the garden, laughing gently at something someone had said. Her dress was simple, deep green, elegant but understated. Her hair was longer now, pulled back in a soft knot, and her skin caught the fading sunlight in a way that made her seem almost not real. But it was her. Sarah. Jason's chest tightened before his brain even fully accepted the sight of her. He hadn't seen her in 5 years. He'd thought about her, often late at night when the silence of the house got too loud. But this was different. This wasn't memory. This was her, here, present, and she wasn't alone. There were 2 boys with her. Identical. Small hands clutched each of hers as she knelt to adjust the collar on one of them. They were laughing. She was smiling in a way Jason hadn't seen in years. Something in his body began to buzz. The boys couldn't have been more than 5. They had dark brown hair, tousled in that effortless way only young children manage. Their skin was fair, their laughter light and natural, but what stopped Jason in place, what made the world around him dull and irrelevant, was their eyes. Both of them. Piercing blue. His blue. Jason's fingers loosened, and the champagne glass tipped slightly before he caught it, the sudden motion drawing a glance from a nearby server. He set the glass down without tasting it. His heart was hammering now, every beat harder than the last. He had no doubt. Not even a question. He was looking at his sons. They weren't just similar to him. They were echoes. His jawline. His nose. His eyes. It was like watching a split photograph of himself as a child multiplied by 2 and brought to life. Sarah didn't see him immediately. She was focused on the boys, gently brushing cookie crumbs off one of their shirts while the other tugged at her arm, pointing to a giant ice sculpture shaped like a swan. Jason took a step forward without realizing it, almost as if pulled by gravity. But then she looked up. Her eyes met his. The moment froze. Her body went rigid. She stood slowly, and for a second her smile faltered. Something unreadable passed over her face, shock, sorrow, maybe guilt. But then she gripped the boy's hands more tightly and turned away, walking swiftly toward the garden exit. Jason didn't move. He didn't follow. Not right away. His mind was spinning so fast it felt like it might burn out. Questions flooded him: when, how, why hadn't she told him, had she planned to disappear, had she been trying to protect them from him? And what had he done, what had he become, that made her believe she had to? But beneath all the confusion, one truth beat like a drum in his soul: those boys were his. And for the first time in years, something cracked open inside him. A need deeper than instinct. A longing more powerful than regret. He had spent 5 years convincing himself that children weren't part of his path. But now he saw clearly, his path had already led to them. He had just refused to look. The laughter around him seemed distant now, detached from reality. The skyline twinkled behind him, and a waiter brushed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, but Jason no longer belonged to the moment. His world had shifted in a single heartbeat, and nothing he had built, no company, no deal, no dollar amount, could compare to what had just walked away from him, hand in hand with the woman he'd once loved and the 2 lives he never knew he had created. As the night fell over the city, Jason remained on that terrace, frozen between memory and revelation, wondering how long he had been blind to what truly mattered, and whether it was already too late to find his way back. The next morning, Jason Harper sat in the corner of his office, not at his desk where he usually reigned like a general overseeing an empire, but on the low leather couch, elbows on his knees, eyes bloodshot and vacant. His tie hung loose around his neck, and the coffee on the table in front of him had gone cold hours ago. He hadn't slept. Not a single moment. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces again, those 2 boys, the curve of their chins, the blue fire of their eyes. His eyes. He had spent the entire night replaying the fundraiser over and over in his mind, analyzing every detail, every glance. Sarah's smile when she looked at them. The way the boys moved beside her. The way they laughed like they had no weight on their shoulders. He didn't understand how he hadn't known. How had she kept it from him? How had she managed to disappear so completely, erase herself from his world, and raise two children who were undeniably his? By 9 a.m., he had already made the call. He didn't even hesitate. There were only two people in his life he trusted with sensitive, personal investigations. One of them was Alex Grant, a retired intelligence officer who now worked as a private investigator. Jason gave him the names and all the details he could remember from the night before. Sarah Harper, formerly Sarah Miles, last known residence 5 years ago, possible new address unknown, twin boys, approximately 5 years old. He didn't tell Alex everything, not yet. But the implication was clear. This wasn't just curiosity. This was urgent. Jason didn't care about business that day. He canceled meetings, postponed briefings, ignored phone calls from board members. His assistant, who had worked with him for over a decade and knew his temperament well, didn't question it. She simply closed his door and told the staff he wasn't to be disturbed. By late afternoon, the first report came in. Alex was fast, always had been. He had already located Sarah's current residence, a modest house on a quiet street in Silver Lake, a world away from the gated palaces of Bel Air and Beverly Hills. Jason stared at the photo included in the report, Sarah in jeans and a t-shirt, standing by the mailbox, her hair tied back, one of the boys holding her hand while the other balanced awkwardly on a scooter nearby. The timestamp showed it was taken just 3 days ago. Beneath the photo was the official information. Their names. Lucas and Liam Harper. Born 6 weeks after Sarah left. Jason blinked at the names again. Harper. She had given them his last name. That small detail hit harder than anything else. She hadn't erased him. She had honored him, even while keeping her distance. A quiet acknowledgement, or maybe a hope that someday he would find them. And he had. He closed the folder and rested his head in his hands. For a man who had spent his adult life avoiding vulnerability, who had prided himself on control and calculation, he now felt completely unmoored. The truth had been walking the earth for 5 years, wearing his face, living outside the walls he had built to protect himself from a life he once thought was too chaotic, too unpredictable. Children, he had once said, were a risk. A weakness. A liability. But now all he wanted was to hear their voices, to see them up close, to know them. The guilt sank in next, slow, thick, inescapable. He had pushed Sarah away that night 5 years ago. She had stood in their home and offered him something real, something lasting, and he had thrown it back at her like it meant nothing. He thought he had made the smart choice, the logical one. Now it seemed like the cruelest mistake of his life. The boys were nearly 6. He had missed their first words, their first steps, the late-night feedings, the tiny socks and storybooks and scraped knees. He had missed it all, and he would never get it back. By evening, Jason was back in his car, parked 2 blocks away from Sarah's house, watching from a distance. He knew it was irrational, borderline obsessive, but he couldn't stop himself. The porch light was on. He saw one of the boys press his face against the front window, shouting something as Sarah came into view behind him. She smiled and scooped him up, carrying him away. A second later, the other boy appeared, racing into view with what looked like a toy sword, chasing a cat down the hallway. Jason laughed softly, unexpectedly. It caught in his throat like a sob. He stayed there until the lights went out, until he was sure they were asleep, and only then did he drive home. But something in him had changed. This wasn't just about watching anymore. It wasn't just about knowing. He had to speak to her. He had to look her in the eye and ask why. He had to ask for a chance, not just for himself, but for them. He didn't know if she would let him in. He didn't know what she would say. But the time for running from his past had ended. He was going to face what he had lost. And if she would let him, he was ready to fight for it. 2 days passed before Jason gathered enough courage to knock on her door. He had gone over 100 scenarios in his head, prepared himself for anger, for slammed doors, even for the boys being hidden away while she refused to acknowledge him. But no amount of rehearsal could truly steady his heart as he stood on the worn wooden steps of the small Silver Lake home. It was so different from the world he lived in, no security gates, no polished marble, no glass towers looming over the skyline. Just a garden full of sunflowers and a wind chime that danced gently in the breeze. The house felt warm before he'd even stepped inside. He knocked twice, then stepped back. His heart pounded like a drum against his ribs. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then he heard movement behind the door, the soft scrape of a bolt sliding, the creak of hinges. When Sarah opened the door, she looked at him with unreadable eyes. She didn't look surprised. It was as if she'd known this day would come and had already accepted it. Jason didn't speak right away. He was too busy trying to memorize her face again, the subtle new lines near her eyes, the way her expression had grown quieter, wiser. She wore a sweater with a faint stain on the sleeve, probably from the kids, and jeans rolled up at the ankle. She looked like someone who no longer lived for appearances, and yet she was more beautiful than he remembered. "Hi," he said finally. The word sounded small, almost ridiculous given everything it carried. "Hi," she echoed, her voice calm, but cautious. She stepped outside and pulled the door halfway closed behind her, leaving only a sliver of the living room visible. Jason noticed a pair of tiny sneakers on the mat just inside. "I saw you the other night," he said, keeping his voice low. "At the event." "I know," she replied. "I saw you too." Jason swallowed hard. "Those are my sons." Sarah didn't flinch. "Yes. They are." The confirmation was like a shot to the chest. Hearing it out loud made it real in a way photos and instinct could never achieve. He lowered his eyes, guilt flashing across his face. "You didn't tell me." "You told me not to," she said gently but firmly. "That night, when I told you I wanted children. You didn't just say no, Jason. You made it perfectly clear there was no place for them in your life. You were angry. Cold. Final. So I made a decision. I left because I wasn't going to bring children into a house where they weren't wanted." "I didn't know you were pregnant," he whispered, almost ashamed to meet her gaze. "No. You didn't." She crossed her arms, not out of defensiveness, but as if holding something together inside herself. "And I didn't want to come back just to be rejected again. I did what I thought was right for them." Jason nodded slowly. "I understand. I do. But I need to meet them. Not as some guy watching from a car down the street. I want to know them. I want to try." Sarah looked down at the porch beneath her feet. "They're happy," she said after a pause. "They don't know they're missing anything. I didn't raise them to feel incomplete. I gave them everything I could. And you," she looked up at him now, her voice softening just a little, "you weren't ready then. Are you really ready now?" "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "But I know I want to be. And that has to count for something." Her eyes searched his, and something shifted in her expression. Maybe it was the honesty in his voice, or the way he looked at her, not as a man trying to take back control, but as someone who had lost something and finally realized what it was. After a long moment, she exhaled. "You can meet them," she said. "But not as their father. Not yet. They don't know you exist, and I'm not going to confuse them with something too big, too fast. You can be a family friend. Someone they get to know naturally. If you're serious about this, if this isn't just guilt or curiosity, then you'll take what I'm offering and earn the rest. Jason nodded, the weight in his chest lifting just enough to let him breathe. I'll take anything you give me. She hesitated only a second more before she opened the door wider and stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and markers. Toys were scattered across the rug. A children's cartoon played softly in the background. And then, two boys peeked around the hallway corner. One held a toy dinosaur. The other had a chocolate smudge on his cheek and a wide, suspicious smile. "Boys," Sarah said with a gentle voice, "this is Jason. He's a friend of mine. He might be coming around sometimes, so be nice." Lucas tilted his head, studying him silently, while Liam grinned and waved his dinosaur. "Hi Jason," he chirped. Jason blinked against the unexpected wave of emotion and knelt slowly. "Hey there. That's a very cool T-Rex you've got." And just like that, the first brick was laid. Not as a father. Not yet. But as someone beginning again. Someone willing to start from zero, with nothing but hope and the silent, urgent promise that he would never turn his back on them again. That night, Jason didn't return to his penthouse. He drove aimlessly through the city, ending up near the playground by Echo Park Lake. He parked and sat in silence, watching the rain beat against the windshield. He thought about how much he had missed. Their first words. Their first steps. Their first birthdays. All the memories that had been built without him. He had no one to blame but himself. But he wasn't just dwelling on regret anymore. He was building something now, something real. Each laugh, each question, each game they played, it all added another layer to the foundation he was laying, piece by piece. Sarah had trusted him enough to let him in. The boys had welcomed him without knowing why. And somewhere deep down, he believed they would understand, when the time came, who he really was. He wasn't their father yet. Not in name. But in every way that mattered, he was starting to feel like one. And that hope, fragile as it was, kept him moving forward. It was a Thursday afternoon when the past came back in the form of an unexpected email. Jason was sitting in his office, half listening to a call with his European partners, when his assistant forwarded him a message marked urgent. The subject line read only one word, Hale. Jason's blood ran cold. It had been years since he'd last heard that name, Mark Hale, Sarah's former boss, the man she had quietly but decisively walked away from after she left Jason. Back then, Jason had only known part of the story, enough to dislike the man, but not enough to intervene. Now, it seemed, Hale was back. And worse, he had discovered something he should never have known. Jason canceled the call without explanation and opened the email. It was from a legal contact, someone discreet, who had come across Hale's name while working with a firm that had suddenly begun compiling information on Jason's personal affairs. Hale had hired a legal team, aggressive, high-profile, the kind used by celebrities in scandal or by corporate raiders. According to the report, Hale had obtained copies of Sarah's rental agreement, old medical records, and disturbingly, birth certificates for Lucas and Liam. Jason's name wasn't listed on the documents, but it didn't matter. The resemblance was undeniable, and Hale was making a move. He was threatening to go public with a story, a damning accusation that Jason had fathered children in secret, abandoned them, and now was trying to force his way back into their lives. It was twisted. It was manipulative. And worst of all, it wasn't entirely false. The truth was far more complicated than that, but in the court of public opinion, nuance didn't matter. If this story got out, it wouldn't just destroy Jason's reputation, it would drag Sarah and the boys into a media storm they weren't prepared for. That evening, Jason drove straight to Sarah's house. His face was pale, jaw tight, his whole body humming with the weight of what he had to tell her. She opened the door and immediately saw something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. Jason paced the living room for a moment before sitting down. "It's Hale," he said. "He knows about the boys. And he's planning to go public." Sarah froze. Her eyes widened with the kind of fear that goes beyond personal anxiety. This was maternal, primal. How? How could he know? "I don't know how deep he went, but he's hired people. He has documents. He's prepared a legal narrative that paints you as the secret mother of my illegitimate children. That I abandoned you, that I'm trying to claim them now out of guilt. He's trying to ruin me, and punish you in the process." Sarah's face hardened. "He tried to control me once. And when I didn't give in, he made my life hell. That's why I left my job, why I moved without telling anyone. I thought I was done with him." Jason leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "You don't have to face him alone. I won't let him touch you. Or them." "But if this story comes out," she began, but Jason cut her off. "Then I go public first. With the truth." Sarah stared at him. "You're willing to admit all of it? The boys? What happened between us?" "I've spent years hiding behind control," he said, "pretending that having a perfect image matters more than having a soul. But I'm done with that. If protecting you and them means destroying the image I built, then so be it." 2 days later, Jason stood in front of a row of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones extended like weapons waiting to strike. He wore no tie, no polished smile, just a simple suit and the weight of a man ready to strip away the armor he'd worn for years. The statement he read was short, direct, and unapologetic. "5 years ago, I made a mistake that changed the course of my life. I let fear dictate my future and walked away from someone I loved. I didn't know then that I was also walking away from my own children. What happened between Sarah and me is private. But what I want to say publicly is this: I am the father of 2 boys, and I am proud of them. I have spent the last few months getting to know them, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for what I lost. If you're looking for scandal, there isn't one here. There's only truth, regret, and a man trying to become better than he was." The room was silent for a beat after he finished. Then the flood of questions began, but Jason walked away from the podium, ignoring them all. The story went viral within hours, but instead of the outrage Hale had been counting on, the public responded with something different. Empathy. Respect. Even admiration. The image of a powerful man owning his faults and choosing his children over his empire hit a chord. That same night, Hale tried to launch his version of events through a gossip site, but it fell flat. People had already chosen their narrative, and it wasn't his. Discredited, embarrassed, and legally outmaneuvered, Hale backed down. He disappeared almost as suddenly as he had reappeared. Jason returned to Sarah's house late that evening. She opened the door, her eyes tired but full of something deeper, relief, maybe even pride. The boys were asleep. The house was quiet. Jason stood in the doorway, not saying anything at first. "You did it," she whispered. "I didn't do it for me," he replied. She stepped back and let him in. For the first time, there was no unspoken wall between them. The danger had passed, but something bigger had changed. Jason had chosen them. Fully, publicly, without fear or hesitation. That night, as he sat beside Sarah on the couch, their shoulders barely touching, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the kind bought by silence or success, but the kind that comes from finally doing what's right, no matter the cost. The morning after the press conference, the sun rose through a thin veil of clouds, casting a muted gold over Sarah's backyard. Jason sat at the small wooden table on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, untouched. Inside the house, muffled laughter echoed from the hallway where Lucas and Liam were chasing each other with cardboard swords, already deep into a pirate game that had started before breakfast. It was chaos, but the kind that settled deep into the bones and felt like life. Jason wasn't used to this kind of noise, this kind of rhythm, where cereal spills and mismatched socks weren't signs of disarray but proof of warmth. He didn't belong here yet. Not fully. But for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to. Sarah joined him on the porch with a soft sigh, wrapping her sweater around her tighter. Her eyes were tired but no longer guarded. The past week had been a blur: reporters, statements, legal cleanups, a few late-night phone calls to mutual acquaintances who'd promised to help keep the worst of the noise away from the boys. But the noise was dying down now, replaced by something quiet, something steady. She poured herself tea and sat across from him, studying his face for a long moment. "They're asking questions," she said gently. "Lucas asked me last night why everyone thinks you're famous." Jason looked down into his cup and exhaled. "What did you tell him?" "I said you were someone who used to think success was about being important to strangers, but now you're trying to be important to the people who matter." A quiet smile pulled at his lips. "That's fair. And Liam wants to know if you'll take him to the Science Museum this weekend. He thinks you're the kind of adult who likes dinosaurs." "I am absolutely that kind of adult," Jason said, his voice warm. "I'll take them. Both of them. As long as they don't try to ride the T-Rex skeleton." Sarah smiled at that and looked away for a moment. "They're starting to feel safe with you. Not just comfortable. Safe." Jason nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle inside him like an anchor. "I won't disappear on them. I want them to know that." "I know," she said quietly. "So do they. Even if they can't say it yet." They sat for a while in silence, sipping their drinks and watching the garden sway gently in the wind. Eventually, Liam burst out the back door with a crumpled drawing in his hand, declaring it was a map to buried treasure and they needed Jason to help find it. Lucas followed close behind, arms crossed, already playing the role of the serious captain who didn't have time for nonsense. Jason folded up his sleeves and let the boys drag him off into the yard, where they spent the next hour digging imaginary holes and uncovering ancient gold in the form of bottle caps and shiny rocks. Later that afternoon, after the treasure hunt had faded into naps and cartoons, Jason found himself alone with Sarah in the kitchen. He was drying dishes while she prepared a lasagna for dinner, the two of them moving around each other with a surprising ease that neither of them had expected to come back. It felt domestic. Natural. Dangerous in the way that old feelings have of sneaking up on you when your defenses are down. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same spoon, and Sarah paused. The air between them shifted. Not heavy, not awkward, just different. A pause full of unspoken things. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and he could see how hard she had tried to build her world alone, how long she had protected herself and the boys with a strength that deserved more than admiration. It deserved partnership. "You're different now," she said, not as a compliment, just as a truth. "I had to be," Jason replied. "I don't want to be the man I was when you left." That man didn't know what he had, or what he was losing. She nodded, then turned back to the stove. "And what about now? What do you want?" Jason didn't answer right away. He set down the towel, walked over to the counter, and stood beside her. "I want a life I don't have to rebuild every time I feel empty. I want a family that doesn't need to be earned with numbers or press releases. I want to sit at this table and be the one they tell about their science projects and nightmares. I want to be more than a name on their birth certificates. I want to be their father. And I want to earn back your trust, not because I'm trying to fix what I broke, but because I want to build something better." Sarah didn't respond immediately. But she didn't pull away either. She looked over at him, and this time, her eyes didn't carry that old caution. They held a question, maybe even a hope she had tried to bury for years. That night, they had dinner together like a family, not a broken one, not a patched one, just a real one. The boys talked over each other, spilling sauce on their shirts, laughing with mouths full, arguing about who would get the last piece of garlic bread. Sarah caught Jason's eye across the table, and he knew that something had shifted. It wasn't the finish line. It wasn't even the start of something new. It was the space in between, where love has a second chance to bloom, not from perfection, but from honesty, patience, and the quiet, steady promise that this time, no one was going to walk away. Spring came softly that year, wrapping Los Angeles in a haze of blooming trees and warm evening winds. Life in Sarah's house no longer felt like something temporary. It had become, unmistakably, a home, not just for her and the boys, but for Jason as well. What had started as weekly visits had quietly evolved into daily moments: breakfast together before school drop-offs, bedtime stories shared on the couch, weekend adventures that ended with tired children asleep in the back seat and quiet, content glances exchanged in the front. The boys no longer called him just Jason. Slowly, without instruction or announcement, they began calling him Dad. The first time Liam said it was by accident, reaching for him during a thunderstorm one night. Jason had tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and as he turned to go, the small voice behind him had whispered, "Good night, Dad." Jason hadn't moved for almost a full minute. That single word unraveled something inside him he didn't even realize had still been holding on. Lucas took longer, true to his quiet, cautious nature. But one morning at the park, while Jason helped him untangle his kite from the branches of a tree, Lucas looked up and asked, "Did you like to fly kites when you were my age, Dad?" He said it so naturally, without hesitation, and Jason's voice caught in his throat before he could respond. It wasn't just acceptance. It was belonging. It was trust. It was forgiveness without needing to say the word. Months passed. The media had moved on. The company Jason had built no longer demanded his every waking moment. He had stepped down from day-to-day operations, handing over the reins to a team he trusted, and focused instead on smaller things, quieter things. He joined the board of a literacy nonprofit. He volunteered at the boys' school once a week. He started reading for pleasure again, something he hadn't done in nearly a decade. He learned how to make pancakes without burning them and how to fold superhero underwear so it didn't wrinkle. His suits gathered dust while his flannel shirts got worn thin. Then one morning, Sarah stood in the doorway of the bedroom, holding something in her hand. She looked pale and stunned in a way that made Jason rise from the bed immediately. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just handed it to him. A pregnancy test. Positive. At first, neither of them spoke. They stood in silence, suspended between disbelief and awe, between old wounds and new beginnings. Jason sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, staring at the thin blue line like it was a map to a future he never thought possible. Sarah lowered herself beside him, unsure of how he would react. But then he turned to her, eyes full, voice quiet. "I didn't think this could happen. I was told I couldn't." "I know," she whispered. "So was I. About us." Jason took her hand and pressed it to his chest. "This baby, it's a miracle." She nodded, and they both laughed through the emotion, not quite able to process the joy wrapped in shock. They hadn't planned this, hadn't even dared to dream it. But the universe had done what science had once claimed impossible. It had given them not only a second chance, but something wholly new. A life that belonged to both of them from the very beginning. When the boys found out, they responded in typical, glorious fashion. Liam immediately declared that he would teach the baby how to fight dragons and insisted the crib be painted green because babies like frogs. Lucas quietly asked if the baby would be able to hear his bedtime stories too, and then spent an hour organizing picture books in order of a niceness. Jason watched them both, heart overflowing with a kind of happiness that couldn't be contained, only lived through, breath by breath, day by day. 9 months later, in a room filled with white light and hushed nurses, Sarah gave birth to a daughter. Jason held her first, overwhelmed and shaking, his chest rising with a quiet sob he didn't try to hide. She was small and perfect, with tiny fingers and the same shade of blue in her eyes that had once haunted him in dreams and now returned to him like a gift. They named her Emma. Back home, the house changed again. There were more sleepless nights, more noise, more mess, but also more love, more laughter, more meaning in the smallest details. Jason would wake early and hold Emma on the porch as the sun came up, whispering promises she couldn't understand yet. He would watch Liam teach her animal noises and Lucas hum lullabies in the hallway. Sarah, radiant even in exhaustion, often stood watching them all, as if checking each moment against memory, making sure it was all still real. Jason knew now that love wasn't something you seized or controlled. It was something you learned to care for, something you fought for by showing up, not once, but every single day. He had lost time, yes. But he had found something more enduring, a family that didn't need to be perfect to be whole, a life that wasn't clean but was honest, beautiful in its bruises and in its healing. And in the soft, ordinary rhythm of their days, among spilled milk and crayon-covered walls, Jason finally found everything he never knew he wanted. Not in the boardrooms or the skyscrapers, but right here, in scraped knees, midnight feedings, quiet forgiveness, and the arms of the people who had once walked away and still welcomed him home. This story isn't just about regret or second chances, it's about transformation. It's about a man who once chose fear over love, control over vulnerability, and still found the courage to return and become the person he was always meant to be. The ending isn't fairy tale perfect, it's honestly happy. Not because every problem vanished, but because the characters finally chose truth over pretense, presence over pride. The birth of their daughter isn't a reward, it's a symbol. Sometimes, life gives you a miracle not to fix what was broken, but to remind you that rebuilding from the ruins, brick by humble brick, is still possible. This is not a story about a man who won. It's about a man who stayed, who faced what he broke, who showed up when it mattered, and who became a father, a partner, and most of all, someone with a real heart.